Welcome to the Solution Nation podcast. My name is Sean Snowday, and I'm the president of Solution Nation. Solution Nation is dedicated to providing a platform for investors to learn about Israel's most dynamic public and private companies. We interview lead venture capitalists, Wall Street analysts, investment bankers, and managers of incubators and accelerators. Today's guest is Renana Ashkenazi, a general partner at Grove Ventures. In this episode, Renana introduces us to investing in genomics. As the cost, speed, and precision of genetic testing continues to improve, genomics is likely to become a more common treatment modality. Renana discusses how genetic sequencing, genetic mapping, and targeted testing can improve healthcare, as well as some of the practical and moral concerns associated with genomics. Please remember that all content provided on the Solution Nation podcast and website is for educational purposes only. Nothing shall be construed as investment advice. Investment decisions shall not be made based on information, written, verbal, or otherwise, posted or spoken on Solution Nation. Conduct your own research or consult with your own investment advisors before making investment decisions. So here's my good friend, the host of the show, and the CEO of Solution Nation, David Wanatik.
Welcome, everyone. I'm David Wanatik. Thank you for joining the Solution Nation podcast series. Today, we're going to have a podcast on issues such as genomics, digital health, and Femtech. Speaking to us today is Renana Ashkenazi. I just want to tell you a few words about Renana Ashkenazi. She comes from a strong technical background and brings almost a decade of product and managerial experience in the areas of technology, global innovation, and strategic marketing. Before joining Grove Ventures, Renana worked at Applied Materials, a global technology leader in several product and technical management positions, and was an engineering research fellow at the Center for Innovation in Global Health Technologies at Northwestern University, developing diagnostic devices for poorly resourced countries. Renana, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Great. So perhaps you can just tell us a little bit about Grove Ventures, the areas that the fund invests in, the stage of development of the companies that you seek, and maybe the average check size that Grove writes.
Sure. So Grove was established in 2017, and when we started the fund, we had a very strong deep tech thesis. We wanted to be the first fund to only invest in deep technologies, but then we realized a lot of people say deep tech and people mean different things, and we also evolved in the types of technologies that we invest in. And today, if you look at the portfolio, we have about 1/3 of our companies that are hardcore hard tech, silicon photonics, quantum computers, supercomputers for space, and advanced semi, and about 2/3 of the portfolio that is much more general tech. So we do a lot of DevOps, dev tools, cloud infrastructure, innovation. We have a very large digital health portfolio by now. We're investing out of our third fund, so all in all, managing about $500 million. And our third fund, which we started investing out of in January, is the $185 million fund. So we focus on early stage investments, primarily pre-seed, seed. We look at with an average check size that varies between, I'd say, $3 to $6 million, depending on the type of company, the sector, and also the year, right? 2021 was pushing everyone's check sizes up.
Okay, good. Yeah, I guess the definitions of rounds varies. 3 to 6 million seems like a lot of money for a pre-seed company, but okay. So I know that you've been doing a lot of work on genomics recently. Maybe we can start by talking about genomics. Perhaps you can just tell us in very simple terms what genomics means.
Yeah, so we were looking quite a bit into genomic genomics innovation and genetic screening innovation, and we see this new era, right, of genetic screening that is based on understanding that encoded in our DNA is basically all the information that we need to tell us how susceptible we are to certain diseases. And basically that allows us to act much earlier, right? Because up until recently, the traditional approach was that once something goes wrong, right? You have high sugar levels, you have BMI problems, you have, I don't know, high cholesterol levels. Once you start showing signs, then you can treat them. But that doesn't make sense, right? What if you could predict those conditions before they manifested themselves? And we know by now that the order in which the nucleic acids that comprise our genome appear determines just about everything, right? Our eye color, how good we'll see, how high we will be. And more we understand that it impacts a lot of other things that maybe weren't trivial up until recently. How athletic we will be, how intelligent we will be, or some studies talk about how funny we are, and it's funny, but 99.9% of our genetic makeup is identical. But then those variations in the 0.1% of the genome account for huge consequences. And what genetic innovation, genomic innovation, genetic screening advancements are allowing us to do is to double click on that, understand what are those variations, and understand what they mean.
Okay.
You've muted yourself.
I'm sorry. So has the genetic map been completed? How much is known about one's genetic makeup or about humanity's genetic makeup?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, because full genome sequencing was performed over a decade ago. What's happening now is that it's becoming much cheaper, right? It's much cheaper to sequence whole genome. The first one cost over $1 billion, and it took over 10 years to perform. And today you could do a full genetic sequencing, and it would cost only a few $100s. Just recently, Ultima Genomics came out of stealth with a promise of full genome sequencing for $100. So imagine you could sequence your entire genome instead of just testing for a specific mutation in a specific gene, which is what we used to do. And it now costs barely anything, and it's very, very fast, right? Because sequencing techniques have also improved. And if you think about COVID, it took, I think, less than 2 weeks after the first reported pneumonia case in Wuhan until scientists were able to circulate the genetic sequence of the virus behind COVID-19. It's becoming cheaper. It's becoming faster. And maybe the most important component is that generates a lot of data, because now that more and more people are getting their either full exome or full genome sequencing, now we have huge amounts of data from which you can derive a lot of very, very interesting insights. Because now you can look not only at specific genes, like BRCA, for example, BRCA1. That's probably one of the most infamous disease genes known to humanity, right? The BRCA1, BRCA2 responsible for breast cancer. There's a group of a few tens of singular genes that are responsible for a specific disease. But now we know that there are much more polygenic diseases, not monogenic diseases, not diseases that are that you could identify from a mutation in a single gene, but diseases where variations in hundreds and sometimes thousands of genes, very small variations, can tell us how susceptible we are to specific diseases, chronic diseases, different types of cancer, and you can only derive those understandings and those combinations of genes from a lot of data that raises a lot of patterns to learn from. So cost, sequencing techniques, and speed, and the amount of data are all drivers or enablers of this genomic revolution.
How common is it for a doctor to order a genetic sequence, or for a doctor to want to understand a specific patient's genetic makeup to treat that patient?
Well, doctors typically don't order today. They don't order full genome sequencing. What they'll do, and that's what was typically done, is when you're in a risk group, right? If you have a family history, you were identified with a potential risk for an inherited disease, then the doctor would send you to do a targeted test, right? That will reveal if you do or do not carry a specific gene mutation. But what happened was this, I think one of the tipping point was around all of those companies that did direct-to-consumer genetic testing. 23andMe, Ancestry, Color, Helix, all of those genetic testing companies that allows you to, for a few $100s, get by yourself. You don't need a doctor to send you to do those tests. You just order them online, and the revenues of those companies, the popularity of those companies has been skyrocketing. The number of genetic tests that those companies are performing are doubling, with many millions of users that have already had their DNA analyzed, and it only continues to accelerate. The market of genetic testing is in the billions. I think the number for 2026, the last one I saw was estimated at $17.3 billion. So it's almost a consumer market.
Right. Are there any downsides to making one's genetic makeup too easily available? With the internet, people think they're doctors now. They can diagnose themselves now, and they know more than doctors now because they Googled something. Are there downsides to learning your genetic makeup? If I learn that I'm predisposed to heart disease or cancer, might I be very depressed? May I be fatalistic about it and say there's nothing I can do because I have a bad gene and I'm going to die anyway, so I'm not going to eat right or exercise? Any downsides that you see in making genetics too available?
That's a very, very interesting question. And I think there are a few aspects to that. One is actually, what can you do with it, right? Because I said all those companies, Ancestry, 23andMe, and all the similar companies, they're providing genetic data to millions of customers. But you can't really make sense of this DNA data without a trained genetic counselor. And there aren't a lot of those, okay? In the US, there are less than 5,000 certified genetic counselors. So that means 1 in, 100,000 Americans actually has access to a clinical genetic counselor. So one problem is how do you actually make sense of that data? But to refer to what you're talking about, there are quite a bit of ethical questions around making this a commodity. For example, can you use prenatal genetic screening to choose a baby's eye color or height? There are a lot of information gap questions, like you were asking. What happens if I discover a mutation that is not treatable, that it's not curable, that I don't have anything to do about it? So there are a lot of ethical, societal questions around making this information more widely available. And I think we'll have to find the ways to answer those questions.
So one can order their genetic sequencing, their genetic makeup, and not have to consult with a certified genetic counselor, correct?
Yeah.
Okay. But but it's maybe advisable to consult with a certified genetic counselor to really understand what's happening with one's genes.
Yep. It also depends on what's the purpose of the test, right? Some people do the 23andMe just to understand, where can they find a cousin. Some people do it because there is a medical indication.
Right. What are the pharmaceutical companies doing with this? Are more of them using genetics to orchestrate their research, or to personalize their medicines to some extent?
Yeah, that's a great question, because we already know that genetic variants will influence a drug's efficacy or adverse events, and that's been widely described. But it's still relatively limited in its use today. I mean, understanding that impact. And there's one example that I just recently read about a chemo drug. It's called a 5-FU. It's a highly effective chemo drug. And for most people, it works really well. But there is a small percentage of the population, about 3 or 4% of the patients, that have a severe reaction to that drug that might be fatal. And as you can guess, that reaction is genetic, and it's based on variations in a specific set of genes. And that's just one example. So testing patients for that specific gene before prescribing that specific medication can clearly impact treatment protocols. So that's one way pharma companies are using genomics. It's called pharmacogenetics, the development of new drugs and vaccines that is based on genomic data, and also the understanding of adverse events, efficacy, side effects based on a person's genetic map.
Okay, so it's being used in cases like chemotherapy, but that's a very controlled situation administered by medical professionals in a facility. Is it viable to make more routine prescriptions genetically sensitive? I mean, even if a doctor would prescribe a drug to be modified in a certain way because the patient has a certain genetic makeup, could the pharmacy fill that prescription?
I'm not sure I understood. Could you repeat the question?
Yeah. So you may have a situation where a doctor realizes that I might need a modification to my medicine because of my genetic makeup. How easy is it to actually produce that specific drug? Is it something that the pharmaceutical company has to produce at the factory, or is it something that a pharmacist could mix?
No, so I understand. I'm sorry. So it's more understanding what drugs will work or not work as well on specific patients, because what you're talking about, personalized medicine, customized medicine, those are things that we probably have. We still have a way to go before we'll have individual personalized prescriptions. It's more of understanding that a specific group of drugs will work better on people with a specific genetic mapping versus others.
Okay. Are genes, do they reside at the cellular level?
Yep.
Okay, so in every cell are genes.
A ton of DNA, yes.
Okay. All right. What about security concerns with making the genetic sequencing known? I believe a couple of days ago, there was an article in one of the newspapers about some generals and so forth being concerned that the Chinese might get access to databases controlled by companies like 23andMe and may make misuse of that.
Yeah, that's definitely a concern of all of those companies. And, it's a concern that arises whenever there is a specific place where a significant amount of data, identifiable data is stored. And those companies will have to address those security concerns and understand how they can secure their servers and their methods of communications to make sure that it doesn't have to be the Chinese government. It could be many other types of attackers that might find that information interesting or valuable. There are a lot of things that we need to. Mm-hmm.
What could a bad actor do? Let's say, a bad actor, whoever it is, obtains a lot of the database that 23andMe controls. What could they do with it to hurt individual people?
I'm not creative enough to, I don't have a criminal mind enough to start answering that question.
Okay. All right. So you also cover some digital health technologies. What's interesting in digital health?
What's not interesting in digital health? Digital health, very similar to many other aspects of our life, has become, or let's say health services, very similar to other aspects of our life, has become more and more digital. And COVID, and I'm sorry to bring up COVID, but COVID has accelerated the move to digital, right? Not only in terms of the types of solutions that were invented and implemented in the past couple of years, but also in terms of regulation, in terms of market education. We moved to digital very fast. Those are processes that could have taken much longer than they did because we had to. And we see a lot of interesting trends around remote patient monitoring, improved workflows, everything around AI-based drug discovery platforms, and a lot of consumer-centric applications as well.
Okay. So as far as like record keeping, digital record keeping, is there anything that you want to say about that?
I'm sorry, about what?
Digital record keeping, doctors, digitizing more of their notes and things like that, and making one's medical record more easily transferable from one doctor to another, or from between hospitals and doctors. Any interesting platforms you're seeing along those lines?
Yeah, we're seeing a lot of information around health IT, operational systems, because a lot of people think that digital health innovation is primarily around clinical innovation and outcomes, but that's not true. There's a lot to improve and a lot of technology and innovation to bring into exactly the areas that you're talking about, the quote unquote boring areas. How do I store? How do I analyze? How do I transport? How do I secure digital healthcare related assets? Especially considering the trend toward digitization of the entire system.
Okay. Do digital health companies typically have to sell to group purchasing organizations, at least in the US, or do they go directly to the physician's practice or directly to the hospitals?
It really, really depends on what they are selling. As with everything in the health system, you could either sell to the provider, you could either sell to the payer, or you could sell to the patient. And it depends on what you're selling and what's the best entry point. Because with the health system, unfortunately, oftentimes the incentive of who will benefit from the product and who is actually paying for the product, those don't always align. So actually, we find that when looking at digital health startups, the most important thing to check is go-to-market business model, buyer persona, and how that validated, and how much validation does the startup have around those areas, and it's not less important than the product, the technology, the team. I mean, making sure that understanding exactly those questions is key when it comes to digital health.
Right. It seems like there's so much investment in digital health, and in Israel alone, there's hundreds of digital health companies, and of course, other countries have lots of digital health emerging companies. It would seem from the point of view of the potential customer that it would be overwhelming to have to try to sort through, a couple hundred potential vendors. So any guidance that you would give to a portfolio company and how to stand out in a very competitive space?
In front of investors or in front of vendors?
In front of potential clients.
In front of potential clients, from what we see, it really depends on who sits in the front seat, right? You want to have someone talking to your customers who has the credentials, the experience, the understanding of how to talk to those customers, how to approach them. Because, oftentimes we think here in Israel that all you need to say is that you served in 8200 or in 81 and that opens doors. That's very powerful here, but it's a bit less impactful in front of potential customers, primarily in the US, which is the target market for pretty much all of the startups here in Israel. And so the experience, the domain expertise, the understanding of the dynamics, all of those are key when approaching US-based customers.
Okay, great. And then the third area that you focus on is Femtech, feminine technology. What are some of the segments within Femtech that are exciting, important, and generating investment?
Those are different questions, because interesting and generating investments are unfortunately not the same. But Femtech is something. Femtech, I say Femtech as if it's something that everyone understands. So Femtech basically is when we talk about Femtech, we're talking about innovations sitting in the intersection between technology and women's health. We're seeing this wave in the past few years of digital solutions that are dedicated to women's health hitting the market. And we'll talk a second about specific areas, but in terms of the investment potential or in terms of the market potential, then it's slightly unfortunate that only now investors are starting to see the potential, because women represent something like 72 or 73% of the U.S. consumption and account for 85% of all consumer purchases. And put that aside, we're 51% of the world's population. And we're seeing more and more innovations, products, and startups, companies in general, that are targeting specific female health issues. Starting around fertility, we're seeing a significant increase in the number of startups that are entering the fertility space. Everything from hardware and diagnostics to community-driven mobile apps and tracking apps. It started with simple mobile apps for period tracking and fertility window detection, and it's evolved to diagnostics, IVF outcome optimization, end-to-end fertility services like Kindbody. So fertility is a major innovation area. We see a lot of period products and tailored period products like Frida, for example, insights into women's reproductive health, smart tampon systems, and we see a lot of startups around pregnancy, apps providing nutritional recommendations, holistic support, and even devices, at-home ultrasound devices. Breastfeeding is also another very hot topic. Menopause is something that is starting to become big. Community support and non-hormonal treatments for menopause systems. And we're starting to see companies around female biotech. where we already know that clinical trial diagnosis for most diseases are focused on men, and have tended to kind of ignore that women's bodies are different and they could react differently. So we're starting to see female biotech innovations around primarily cancer, but all sorts of indications.
Okay. So this is a general question that could apply across your portfolio companies. So you invest in early stage opportunities. I would imagine that you would want the founders to be committed, very committed to their companies, and as evidence of that commitment would be holding shares of those companies. How do you structure deals, or how do you work with entrepreneurs in such a way that they maintain a large holding of shares, but also have the ability to sell some of those shares as time goes on? Everybody needs money. So how do you structure deals so they can sell some of their shares while maintaining a very high commitment to their companies?
So that's always, there's always a delicate balance between wanting to have a high ownership in the company and wanting to liquidify some of your holdings over time. Typically, when we invest, which is very early, those are not questions that we have to handle in day one. We do confront those issues, and closer to the company's round B and further, and that's really a case by case discussion where we do urge our founders to see some fruit in their work. Right? We don't think secondary is a bad word. We think it should be applied in a way where you still hold enough shares in the company to benefit from the long-term success.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And then are you impressed when a potential portfolio company approaches you and demonstrates that they have received grant funding? Are there any follow-up questions you would ask to determine the quality of that grant funding, or how difficult it was to receive, or strings attached to grant funding?
Yes, all of the above, right? Not all grants were created equal. And I think the most important thing to understand is not necessarily how difficult it was, because that doesn't really matter. What really matters is what are we going to pay for this, right? What are the strings attached? Because non-dilutive funding is great in theory, right? It's free money, but it never really is free money, right? So you want to make sure that you fully understand the small letters, right? Because even if it doesn't have an impact now, it might have an impact when an acquisition offer is coming, or when we want to go public. So understanding the short, mid, and long-term implications of taking the grant is something that we, of course, look at.
Okay. All right. Perhaps you can introduce us to three of your portfolio companies. I know you probably like all of your portfolio companies, but maybe three different ones.
Well, I love all of our digital health portfolio companies. I could just mention them all, and maybe you could focus on a couple. So we have Navina. Navina is a company that focuses on improving the workflow of primary care physicians. And the premise of the company, other than the fact that it was built by phenomenal founders, is that today the primary care physician spends a ton of time mining data, right? Gathering all the relevant data for his patient from the EMR, from various inputs. And doctors are doctors, but they're not data miners. And what Navina does is basically generates what we call a patient portrait that puts in front of the physician everything he needs to know about the patient, but does it in a very concise, very quick, and very accurate way. So that's Navina. We have Protai, which is an AI-based drug discovery platform that is based on proteomics and not only genomics data, adding this additional data on top of what's already available today. And we have Nucleai, which is looking at, it's an AI-powered spatial biology company that is helping drug development and clinical treatment decisions, because it's basically providing a lot of insights and additional information into pathology data. Tingo is a continuous glucose monitoring company, and a couple of other companies still in stealth.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. The first one you mentioned, Navina, Navina. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Great. Are there any concluding comments that you would like to make?
I think digital health is one of those areas where it's very clear that there is huge potential. It couldn't boom years ago because the market had to go through an education process where there was room for a lot of technology and innovation, but doctors and the system and regulation wasn't yet ready to adopt those advancements. And we're getting there. And I think we're going to see huge success stories in this field in the next few years. And Israel is probably one of the most interesting areas in the world to see this innovation ecosystem growing.
Great. Renana Ashkenazi, I'd like to thank you for spending all this time with us and sharing all of your experience and your knowledge with us. We covered a lot, everything from genomics to digital healthcare to feminine technology. We appreciate you sharing some of your portfolio companies, introducing them to us a bit. For those Israeli entrepreneurs that are looking for early stage investment, Grove VC is a great place to go and to talk to their VCs. And my understanding is that in addition to investing capital in companies, Grove also supports the companies a bit. I talked to Ben Ofer, your marketing director, and he told me that the fund, Grove, also does some marketing on behalf of their portfolio companies and helps with other administrative issues like HR. You can correct me if I'm wrong, but that's what I understand.
No, I think that's one of the things we're most proud of. The support and the value that we provide our companies and founders, and you can't be a good early stage fund without having your companies back. So, like Ben said, we have HR, marketing, value creation, legal, finance support for our teams, and we feel like we're the employees of every single portfolio company.
Okay, great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.